Welcome, everyone. Let us begin by lighting the Temenos candle. And like last time, Tom and I would then like to share the little Pythagorean Platonic invocation with you all after we hold a moment's silence. May we be guided by truth, have beauty revealed to us, and may it result in the good. So, welcome all to the Lincoln Center and to the final Michaelmas term lecture in this Temenos Academy 2020 series. My name is Daniel Doherty, and once again I'm delighted to be here introducing friend and colleague Tom Bree and his talk this afternoon entitled Plotinus and the Planets. I'm sure that I speak on behalf of all of us gathered here and all joining us via the webcast link when I say a heartfelt thank you to the Temenos Academy and to Stephen and Genevieve, particularly for the daily orchestrations involved in the running of the Academy. How vital in these turbulent times to be here together in person and continuing to engage in the essential questions. Much gratitude and appreciation to the Lincoln Center for their warm hospitality also. It is good to see so many faces, or at any rate, some faces and many eyes. I am ever so grateful that we are still able to use our eyes, portals between worlds. How long, dare I say it, are we all floundering about? How long before we are all floundering about with our VR headsets and augmented or blended reality Google glasses or the like? While we have eyes, let's use them. What better way to use them than to facilitate a rekindling of that dulled and dimmed inner eye, that organ of perception, that Socrates so revered. A favorite Plotinus passage of Tom's, and so also of our dear teacher, Keith Critchlow, reminds us, to any vision must be brought an eye adapted to what is to be seen and having some likeness to it. Never did I see the sun unless it had first become sunlike. Never did a cold, damp wick readily receive an illuminating flame. And how to develop the sun-like eye and the warm wick? We can, as Plotinus and Tom love to do, turn to Plato. Timaeus tells us, the purpose of this gift is as follows. The gods invented and supplied us with vision to enable us to observe the rotational revolutions of the heavens, the rational revolutions of the heavens, and to let them affect the revolutions of thought within ourselves, which are naturally akin to those in the heavens, though ours are turbulent while they are calm. That is, the gods wanted us to make a close study of the circular motions of the heavens, gain the ability to calculate them correctly in accordance with their nature, assimilate ours to the perfect evenness of the gods, and so stabilize the wandering revolutions within us. This gift and desire of the gods is central to the work and teaching practice of Tom Bree. I have no doubt that his talk and accompanying visuals will be most pleasing not only to the gods and Timaeus, but also to all present here today. So without further ado, dear Tom, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks for reminding us to look up. We shall be doing a lot of that during this talk. We'll just get the PowerPoint shared. Okay. So, Plotinus and the planets. Now, obviously, the name partly expresses what I'm going to be talking about, but I'm going to give a few descriptions first, go through a few ingredients, a few raw materials, which are going to then form this journey from the one to the many. Everything begins from the one. And from the one, there's a movement outwards into multiplicity, into cosmos. The actual meaning of the word cosmos, it has two aspects of meaning. It means order. And so in that sense, something that is harmonious, something that is multiplicitous, which works together as one harmonious order. But in another sense, it also means adornment. And so in that sense, it's an outward appearance of something that could be described as being beyond it, something that transcends it, but becomes apparent through that which embodies it, or that which reflects it. And in that sense, it is an adornment. And when we look at what's going on in the wider cosmos beyond planet Earth, what we see are lots of spheres moving in circular motions around other spheres and forming spiral-shaped galaxies. So clearly, it's a very geometric place. On these spherical orbs, you even find the odd bit of rectilinear geometry, straight line geometry, such as with the North Pole of Saturn that has a hexagonal atmospheric formation on it. You can fit about 3 planet Earths into that. The edge of the hexagon is just a bit longer than the mean diameter of Earth. On the north and south poles of Jupiter, we see 5 and 8. A 5-fold form around a central one and an 8-fold form around, again, around a central cyclone. Now let's come down to Earth and we'll look at 5 and 8 again, this time in organic floral form. Now all of these geometries that we're looking at, all of this order, it's always reflecting the ideal. You never have a perfect example of the geometry. And I'm always pointing this out to my students when we're drawing geometry. It's impossible to draw the perfect pattern. The very fact that you can see a line that you've drawn means it's not a line, because a line, properly speaking, has no width. It only has length. So a line technically is invisible. But thank God we can see the lines, because then we can see the pattern, and then we're reminded of what the pattern draws the soul up towards. So for instance, if we looked at this pentagonal flower here on the right, is it pentagonal? If we're going to be really fussy, look at that line, it's wavy and it's a bit curved. It's not a perfect pentagon, but it very clearly resembles a pentagon. And in another sense, who would want to have a flower that has perfect angular straight lines? Thank goodness for that reflection of the ideal form of number. So when we look, whether it's at things growing in this world on planet Earth or looking at the geometry of planets beyond planet Earth, it's never perfect relationships in arithmetic terms. It's very close near misses, reflections of the ideal. So in one sense, you could say that the manifest form is an imperfect copy, but in another sense, you could say that the manifest form is ideal for this manifest world, with like what I said about the line. You know, thank goodness we can see the line, even though it's not perfect in terms of its archetype. Now, I want to begin with a very simple geometric fact, and this is something that will inform some of what we see through the talk. Now, if you remember your maths classes at school, hopefully they don't bring back too many bad memories. I failed my maths GCSE, I have to say, so there'll be nothing too complex in this talk, you may be pleased to hear. The measurement of the circle in relation to the diameter is 1 to pi, pi being 3.14. Now, one way in which this is talked about in approximate terms, and we know this was used in the ancient world for an approximation of pi, and that was dividing the circumference up into 22 equal parts. And it can then be said that the diameter is made up pretty much, but not quite, of 7 of those parts. It's a close rational approximation, rational as in ratio, 22 to 7, a relationship of 2 numbers. Pi itself is what's known as an irrational number. So it's not actually possible to divide the circumference of a circle up into equal size units and to then use that same unit to also divide up the diameter. Not possible. So we'll look at this 22 to 7 relationship, which is essentially 1 to pi, 1 to 3.14. And that 3.14 can be looked upon really as 3 and 1/7, because 22, if you say 7, 14, 21, that would take you to 3, and then 1/7 extra makes it 22. Now, having said that, pi does actually have this direct relationship with the number 3 itself. It's a very simple fact that doesn't seem to get pointed out very much. And it's to do with the fact that the circle contains 6-fold symmetry within it. If you use the radius of the circle, you can divide the circle up into 6. So this helps you to draw the hexagon Now, each one of these edges of the hexagon is the same as the radius of the circle. So in that case, you could say that each edge is 3.5, because that's obviously half of 7. So in that case, we can say that each edge measures 3.5. And so in that case, if we multiply 3.5 by 6, we'll get the peripheral measurement of the hexagon, and the answer is 21. Now that is 3 to 1, 21 to 7, whereas the circle itself going around the hexagon is 22 to 7. So there's this natural relationship of pi with 3. Now this is something that's going to come up during the talk, so that's why I've brought this particular subject up. Now another thing I need to briefly mention are Lucas numbers and Fibonacci numbers. Lucas numbers are like Fibonacci numbers. They're a number sequence which gradually grows by taking the number that you're on, adding it to the number before, and that gives you the following number in the sequence. Now what this builds up with each pair of numbers, a larger number to a smaller number, are closer and closer approximations of the golden ratio, which is 1.618 to 1. The Lucas numbers are really just another version of the Fibonacci sequence. The Fibonacci numbers, the only difference they have is that they begin with 1, whereas the Lucas numbers begin with 2. And so it gets this whole different sequence of numbers because it begins with 2. Now within these Lucas numbers, they're important in relation to this unfolding of the planets. And what I want to show is that within the pi circle, you can also get the seeds of the golden ratio as well with these numbers here in the Lucas sequence, 7, 11, 18, and 29. 7 is, of course, the diameter. 11 is the semicircle. So if we add those two together, we get the next number. 7 plus 11 is 18. And then if we add the final 11 in here, this right-hand side of the semicircle, then you get 29. So those four numbers are all there within the pi circle. And this is where the golden ratio begins to actually come from within the pi circle, as you'll see. Now, I don't have the time to go into any detail in relation to Plotinus and his philosophy, and I'm definitely no expert on Plotinus, but I want to just briefly mention the parts that make up his philosophy, his way of seeing things, because they naturally seem to be reflected in the relationships between the sun and the first three planets, and so hence the name of the talk. Now, I'm going to use the Pythagorean tetractys here just as something to focus on, with these four levels, or 3 plus matter. Now, the one, I can't really say anything about the one, because the one is beyond everything. By talking about it, I'm not talking about it, because by talking about it, I'm suggesting that there is the one and something other than the one, but the one is the all. So the less said, the better. Now, the first principle, properly speaking, is nous, intelligence. And nous has this two-ness about it, so hence the two in that second level of the tetractys. The intelligence contemplates the one, but also the contents of its own thoughts. Now that intelligence can then, I suppose, it doesn't come down a level, rather the soul, which is also twofold, has one part of it that looks up towards the intelligence. And that is the higher part of the soul. And then the lower part of the soul is the one that looks down towards matter and is the generative principle, so that it helps to bring things forth. And that occurs in the world of matter, the fourfold world of matter, the four corners of the earth. Now, I'll go through these bit by bit as we go through the talk. So that's just a very simple description, and I apologize to any Plotinus experts who would be able to say that much better than I just have. So, as I just mentioned, when you look at the sun and the first three planets, they seem to reflect Plotinus's way of understanding things. So if we think of the sun as being the one, Mercury as being nous, intelligence, Venus is the soul, and the Earth is matter. And so we have this emanation out from the one, outwards to those three planets. Now, the thing that we'll see as this happens, there are these 2 points that I'll keep on referring to. First of all, at the beginning of this emanation, things show themselves as pi, but then somewhere around Mercury and Venus, they transmute into the golden ratio, or phi. So when I use the word phi, I'm meaning the golden ratio. Now, the other thing to watch out for is that at the beginning, in that pi zone, as it were, that's where the 3 primary musical ratios show themselves. Whereas when you have this transmutation into the golden ratio, that is where those 3 musical ratios become arranged into the musical octave, because that's reflected in the Fibonacci numbers. Now, Plotinus himself actually used the sun as a metaphor for the one. For again, that only can be named the good to which all is bound and itself to none. For only thus is it veritably the object of all aspiration. It must be unmoved, while all circles around it as a circumference around a centre from which all the radii proceed. Another example would be the sun, central to the light which streams from it and is yet linked to it, or at least is always about it irremovably. So let's begin with the sun itself. Now the sun, I'm just going to talk about as itself, not in relationship to any planets, because we're beginning from the one. So there's not much I can say, because obviously time begins once we have something moving around the sun. But having said this, there is a cycle within the sun itself. Now what happens in the solar cycle is that from the beginning, there's a gradual buildup of sunspot activity, and then it reaches its maximum around the middle of the cycle, and then it dies back down again and goes back to having not so much activity. Now, another thing that happens is that the poles invert during this cycle. As a result of this cycle, the North Pole and the South Pole of the sun invert. So let's look at that metaphorically, because I don't have any time cycles. I can't talk about years and days because they're Earth cycles. So let's just look at it in relation to the pi circle. And let's look at this in one sense as a circle divided 22 to 7, but let's also look at it as an image of the sun itself. So if this is the North Pole of the sun, we'll say that there's this movement outwards of sunspots and then a dying back down again, and then we're down at the South Pole, so the poles have inverted. So figuratively, we can talk about this as being a duration of 11 units. Or 1 semicircle's worth of time. Now, it so happens that if we now talk about this as being a duration of time in relation to that, so 7 units of time, there's a significant thing that Mercury does around the sun over that duration of time. It actually goes around the sun 29 times. And 29 is, of course, the sum of 22 plus 7. Now, as we'll see, both Venus and Earth actually recognize this 29ness of Mercury as a 22 plus 7. And so the pi-ness, or the understanding of pi-ness, is there within this 29ness of Mercury around the sun. Now, moving beyond Mercury and out to Venus, this is an image from John Martineau's little book of coincidence. Now, as you can see, the threeness of Mercury is really showing itself in relation to Venus, the threeness of Mercury. So there is this natural threefoldness that you can put in like so, and it will then define the distance of Venus's mean orbit. If you take Mercury's mean orbit. Mercury's got a very eccentric orbit, a very elliptical orbit. So you have to take the mean, and that's what John did with this particular image. So if we're talking in a Platonian way, you can say that this threeness emanates from the intelligence out to the soul. Now, another thing that's there with the relationship between Mercury and Venus can be defined by this star here, which has 11 points on it. Now, again, it's 11 and 7, as I described with the sun. 11 and 7 is what is significant in what I'm about to show you. Now, if we put these two circles in, you see how they're naturally nesting a star within them. And this one also, you can see a smaller circle here with the actual 11-sided shape within it. This very closely defines the eccentricity of Mercury's orbit. So Mercury's elliptical orbit stays pretty much within these limits. It goes ever so slightly over on both sides, just a very small amount. So let's depict the two planets in this particular location. So the outer circle is Venus, and then within this zone here is where Mercury is. Now let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So that's one complete orbit of Mercury. 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. 11 plus 7, 18. So Mercury has gone around a whole amount, 11, plus another 7, whereas Venus has just gone around 7. And this is where they then conjunct, where they're in a straight line with the sun. So the first time since they started at the top. Now, having said that, they actually conjunct, properly speaking, ever so slightly beyond it. So does that just discount the whole thing? As I'll show a bit later on, it actually allows something very interesting to come in. It's actually through this that the golden ratio arises out of the pi, and it's through the actual difference between them. Now, I'll talk about that when the numbers come in. So I briefly showed you this Fibonacci sequence earlier on. I'm going to concentrate on these two numbers, 5 and 8. These are two of the numbers which give an approximation of the golden ratio. 8 to 5, 8 divided by 5 is 1.6. And so it's a reflection of 1.618, which is the golden ratio. Now I'm showing you this because this is one of the first indications of the golden ratio coming in. Now what you're looking at here, you can see how the two container circles that are containing the stars, they're the same size, but also the two smaller circles. So you can see the circle that's containing the pentagon and the circle that is being contained by the octagon. They're virtually identical in size. This is something John Martineau points out again in his little book of coincidence. Now, if you were to say that the larger circle has a radius of 1, then those two smaller circles, the one on the left in the pentagon is 0.382, whereas the one within the octagon is 0.383. Now, the reason for showing you these is because if you have those two circles, the smaller one and the larger one, they very closely approximate the size of Mercury to Earth. So this knowledge that the intelligence has of the golden ratio in some way shows itself in its relationship with Earth. But if Mercury transmits the knowledge of phi to Earth, it's actually Venus that generates this knowledge, because Venus also plots out a 5-pointed star and an 8-pointed star in relation to Earth. So whereas Mercury has the knowledge, it actually becomes generated through movement with the soul, and the soul bringing that number down to the world of matter, down to the earthly world. More images from John Martineau's little book of coincidence, the pentagram on the left and the octagram on the right. And of course, 5 and 8 are these consecutive Fibonacci numbers. Now, the best way to show this is in a film. Rupert, if you could put the film on, please. This is a film in which a couple of my students actually walk the Venus-Earth relationship to some medieval court music. And so they're walking in rhythm to 2 circles that have been divided up with different numbers, which reflect their relationship. And so you can naturally see how the 5-fold symmetry actually develops. You'll see there are these longer pieces of tape, there's 5 of them, on the 5 divisions of the circle. And these are the conjunction points. Oh, I think you had it already on as well. I think one of the shares you could have done was the actual screen itself. The white one on the right. Yeah, that one, yeah. So you can see how the fivefold symmetry works very easily when you see that. Now, if we look at the equivalent thing to get eightfold symmetry, because Venus and Earth also plot out the eight-pointed star. So let's imagine that we have our 2 points and that they're going around in a similar way to what we just saw, anti-clockwise, as the planets do. Now, rather than showing the whole sequence, what I'm going to do is show you what happens if we show them having done complete cycles. Now, there's 32 steps in Venus's circle and 52 in Earth's. So if we say that they both go 32 steps, Venus has ended up back at the beginning point and Earth has only got this far. So if they go another 20 steps, so a total of 52, then we can say that Earth is back at the starting point, but where Venus is at this point is where you get the octagram star from. So if we draw a line from where Venus started to here, and if we continue like that, so if we say 32 plus 20, Venus will end up there. Now again, 32 plus 20, and Venus will end up here. And again, 32 plus 20, and so on. And you can see the gradually forming octagram star. So in that cycle, you can have both 5 and 8 in geometric terms. So if we imagine the orbit of Venus being in between that of Mercury and Earth, you can say that the intelligence emanates out that knowledge of 5 and 8, but the actual generating of it is what the soul does. So the soul allows the generating of that intelligence to come down to Earth. Now, what you were just looking at there is what's called the synodic cycle of Venus. So within the synodic cycle of Venus, there are 5 conjunctions, and so hence the pentagram comes forth from that. Now, I showed this slide when I gave the talk a couple of weeks ago about Wales Cathedral, because I was talking a lot about the symbolism of the morning star and the evening star. The morning star rises up into heaven, the evening star falls down into the earth, symbolically speaking. Morning star rises in the east, the evening star sets in the west. Now, this twofoldness of the soul is something also that Plotinus comes out with, and Plotinus actually associates Aphrodite with the soul and with these 2 aspects of soul. So it's there even in Plotinus's own way of seeing things. I'll have to read that quote because it's covered up at the moment. That's better. To us, Aphrodite is twofold. There is the heavenly Aphrodite, daughter of Uranus of heaven, and there is the other, daughter of Zeus and Dion. This is the Aphrodite who presides over earthly unions. So Venus's movements naturally reflect this particular aspect of Plotinus's philosophy as well. And so we find ourselves down to earth. Now, I could give a whole talk on this. I have done over the last few years on various occasions. This is an amazing discovery by John Michell, who you may be aware of because he used to also give talks for the Terminus Academy. What he pointed out is a very interesting relationship between the Earth and the Moon. They have this relationship of 11:3 in terms of their diameters. So if we put them into squares like so, then we can say the square with an edge of 11 and the square with the edge of 3, and then in goes this pyramid triangle. Now again, 11 and 7 is there because the pyramid triangle has a base of 11 and a height of 7. And this leads to this really amazing piece of research, which only works if you use the mile. And so this is part of John Michell's, part of what he talked about a lot was how the mile is a naturally existing unit of measure rather than one that we've invented. Now, I can't go any further with this. Like I said, I could give a whole talk on it, but I'll I'll just have to leave it there. But just to show you the 11 and the 7 and this relationship of Earth to Moon. Now, having said that, the pyramid triangle, and this type of triangle is the cross-section of the type of pyramid that the Great Pyramid is. That's another part of the whole storyline. So it has a base of 11 and a height of 7, but there's an exceedingly similar triangle, which technically is different. It's a different triangle altogether. In modern mathematics, it would probably be called a mathematical coincidence, but I much prefer to call it significantly similar. Now you see that one on the left, it has a baseline of 2, a height, which is the square root of the golden ratio, and then the 2 sloping sides are golden number, 1.618. If you scaled up these 2 triangles, so they have the same baseline, which was the same as the Great Pyramid, they'd only be about 3 inches different from one another in height. So they're virtually identical. They're so similar. Right, now we're down to Earth, we can bring in this whole other dimension of things, which is the Earth day and the Earth year. These Earth time cycles, they seem to be significant in relation to everything else that's going on beyond Earth, or at least in relation to the Sun, Mercury, and Venus. When we use these earthly cycles, and this is obviously how we usually define these planetary relationships, but when we actually use them now, because I wanted to point out how we didn't have them until we got to Earth, but they bring in something really interesting, whereby it does make these first 4 planets, and no doubt the planets beyond as well, all one overarching relationship, one expression of the divine mind. So with the day, the 24-hour day, and the Earth year in mind, which of course it's the spin of Earth upon its axis is a day, the orbit of Earth around the Sun is the year. When I talked about the Sun cycle being 11 units, and I use this as I suppose as a way of addressing that, it is actually 11 years in length. And so inevitably, this Mercury relationship, whereby Mercury goes around the Sun 29 times, 22 plus 7, it is 7 years. It takes 7 years. So the relationship of semicircle to diameter, when we have that pi relationship, is there with the Sun and Mercury. So you could say that the Mercury is contemplating the One by bringing forth this pi geometry, because the pi geometry is there in the first place with the 11-7, or the 11-fold relationship of the solar cycle, the 11-year cycle. Now, the other thing is that Mercury's orbit takes 88 Earth days. So 88, of course, links in directly with 22, because it's just 4 times 22. So we can start to see Mercury's pi-ness in relation to the Earth cycle. Now, here's a visual to show it. Mercury's orbit there in the middle is divided up into 22 steps, and Earth there, I haven't divided that, that doesn't need it. So I'll count again. So looking at Mercury, beginning with the conjunction. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Now the conjunction hasn't happened yet, so how more extra beyond the 22 will the conjunction be? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and there's a conjunction. Now it's not absolutely bang on, but it's very close indeed. Within the 7-year cycle, it's a few days off. Now if we keep on doing that, so we keep on having 22 plus 7, this is where the conjunctions happen. And you can sort of see the pattern beginning to develop, these 3 areas, but going 1 more each time, because of course that is the 21 plus 1 equals 22, so it's always changing in that way each time. And then finally back up where they started, not exactly in the same positions, but very close. So Earth understands the pi-ness, or at least it receives the pi-ness of Mercury in that orbital relationship. Now, I'm really sorry to have to present you with a table. I won't talk about future projected profits or anything of that sort. I'm just going to talk about planetary figures. So you can see in the top line, the orbital periods in these two middle lines, these are the two different days. Now, I won't go into detail on them, but the solar day is the turn of a planet in relation to the sun, whereas the sidereal day is just the turn of a planet in relation to itself, as it were. Because, of course, as a planet is going around the sun, or as a planet is turning, rather, it's also going around the sun. So that means that the solar day and the sidereal day are going to be slightly different, depending on what's going on with the planet. And the synodic cycles down here, these are the ones like the one I showed you of Venus creating the 5-pointed star. So that's where you have the conjunction cycles between planets. So 88 days, 88 plus 28, because of course 22 plus 7, if you multiply both those numbers by 4, you get 88 plus 28. 88 plus 28 equals 116. So that's the conjunction cycle of Earth and Mercury. Now, if we bring in the solar day, and bearing in mind that the 88-day orbital period, this is where Mercury contemplates the one by orbiting the sun. But another way in which Mercury contemplates the one, the sun, is through its solar day. So the turn upon its axis in relation to the sun. Now, rather amazingly, the relationship between these two is exactly 2 to 1. 176 is 2 times 88. So if we have a musical string here, we can say that the orbital period, the 88 days, gives us the 2 to 1 musical ratio, which is the first musical ratio amongst the 3 Pythagorean ratios. So if you have the open string, and then you press the string down in the middle, you'll get the first note of the octave and then the 8th note of the octave. So if we went, that would be the difference between the two. The first one being the pitch of the string, the second one being what you get when you press the string down in the middle. Now, the really fascinating thing about this is that the sidereal day, so this is Mercury, you could say, I suppose, contemplating its own thoughts rather than contemplating the one, because the sidereal day isn't to do with its movement in relation to the sun. Sorry, that's my computer. Now, the sidereal day is this, and this is exactly 2/3 of 88. So if we put that in there, that gives us the 3 to 2 musical ratio. Now, these two musical ratios are what you need to produce the musical octave. And by having the 3 to 2 musical ratio, you automatically have the third musical ratio, which is 4 to 3, because 3 to 2 and 4 to 3 together make the octave. So Mercury has, with these 3 measurements, these 2 primary musical ratios with which the octave can be made. They're the raw materials. It hasn't turned into the octave yet, the series of 8 notes, but they are the raw materials required for that. And with Mercury, it's very precise indeed. In this relationship here of 88 to 58.666, that's been very slightly rounded up. They're both a tiny bit below that. But this is the one piece of planetary geometry that is accepted within modern science. And it's known as the spin-orbit resonance. So exactly 3 to 2. Now, if we were to just look at 88, that spin-orbit resonance I just mentioned, still, this would still be the 3 to 2, because now we have, rather than saying that we have 3 to 2, we can do it the other way around and say that we have 3 to 2. So this one here is the generative ratio. It's the one that actually allows the musical octave to become, because you just begin with the octave, which is the range within which everything happens. But once you have that musical fifth at 3 to 2, then you can actually produce the whole octave of notes, of 8 notes. So that's what's happening with Mercury. If we come down to Venus, as you can see, Venus's solar day is very similar to this pi relationship that Earth has with Mercury. It's slightly off, but interestingly, it's very close indeed to the other 3 to 2 point on the other side of the string. If it was a little bit more, 117.33, then it would be at that particular musical ratio point. But if it went down to 116, then it would be at that pi relationship that Earth has with Mercury. So it's in between the pi and the 3. And this particular one is I suppose, the part of Venus that's looking towards the sun, looking towards the one, because it's the solar day of Venus. Now, I mentioned earlier how pi slowly transmutes into phi, and this then produces the musical octave. So that's what I'm going to come to next. Now, remember, I said about how the conjunction between Mercury and Venus, it's slightly off 7/11ths of the circle. Now, if we actually have them on here, the conjunction happens later, but the amount of time it takes for the two planets to reach this particular line, the 7/11ths of the star, Mercury moves 11 plus 7, as I showed you, whereas Venus just moves 7. Now, it takes Mercury 144 days to get to there, whereas Venus gets there a little bit earlier. Venus gets there after 143 days. So the difference that they have in terms of when they reach this line is defined by 1 Earth day. And so the Earth day, as it were, becomes born from this difference between the intelligence and the soul. But the plot thickens when you look at this in relation to the Fibonacci numbers. It really is amazing. Lucas numbers and Fibonacci numbers. So Lucas numbers first, Fibonacci numbers next. Now I'm going to just highlight 2 in each one, the 6th and the 7th in each of those sequences. Now I'll color code them as I did with that image of before of Mercury and Venus. So the Mercury numbers I'm going to say are 8 and 18, and the Venus numbers I'm going to say are 13 and 11. Now 18 is of course the number that Mercury uses to get to where it is. It's 11 plus 7, whereas 11 is the range that Venus is moving within. It does 7 within that 11. Now, if you multiply these numbers together, 8 multiplied by 18 gives you 144, which is the Mercury number of days, whereas 11 times 13 is 143. So within the use of this Earth day, you get this rather amazing mathematics with these sequences, which obviously they're always true. They're always there. But all of this planetary movement corresponds to that arithmetic. Now, the other interesting thing about this is that it brings us into the Fibonacci numbers to 8 and 13. And this is actually the relationship between the orbital periods of Earth and Venus. Now, as I showed you before, Venus produces 5 and 8, pentagram and octagram. But the period of time it takes is 8 Earth years, which is the same as 13 Venus years. So you have 8 and 13, which come out of those Lucas numbers that I was showing you just a minute ago. So what we can say is that the relationship of Venus's orbit to Earth's orbit is very closely reflected by 8 to 13. So if we say Venus's orbit is 8, Earth's orbit is 13, we can see that Earth divided by Venus gives 1.6255, whereas 13 divided by 8 is 1.625. They're so similar. Now, if we now look at the synodic cycle, so that's the one that we looked at in the film, with those 5 conjunctions creating the pentagram star, the relationship of Earth's orbit to the synodic cycle is 5 to 8. And so we have 5, 8, 13 in the Venus orbit, or the Venus-Earth relationship. Now, 5, 8, 13 is also the basis of how to construct the musical octave. Now, I know there's loads of information I'm giving out here, but this is going to be recorded, or it is being recorded, and so you can look at it again online, because there's a lot to soak in one talk. Here we have a depiction of the musical octave. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, as you can see, the distances or the intervals between the notes are different. There are larger ones and smaller ones. If you're not a musician, I'll just describe simply, the smaller ones are called semitones, the larger ones are tones. But a tone is made up of 2 semitones. Now let's depict that this time on a musical string. So we've got the musical string with the 2:1 musical ratio in it. That gives us the first note and the 8th note within the octave. We put the 3:2 musical ratio in, which I showed you earlier in the Mercury geometry. That'll give us the musical fifth, which goes up to this line here. Now 3:2 plus, 4:3. So this is the third musical ratio. And like I said, the 4:3 and the 3:2 together make an octave. So the 3:2 is the fifth, what's known as the musical fifth, and the 4:3 is the musical fourth. So you can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 5, that's the musical fifth. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, taking you up to the octave with 4 notes. Now, how about if we turn it around? We flip it around, so we have the fourth first. Now we have the line dividing them here. And so we can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so we're just doing the same thing the opposite way round. But what this makes possible is this here, which is the tone. So the difference, when we flip them around, we can get this tone in, and the tone is known as the 9/8, because on the musical string, that's its position on the string. Now this becomes the building block of the musical scale. So if we begin from 1, we say 1, 2, 3, 4, just over semitone, 5, 6, 7, and then up to the octave. Now, having said that, if we do make all of the tones into semitones, we then have something called the chromatic scale, which is made up of 13 semitones, like so. Now that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So much smaller intervals. But are you seeing the numbers? 8, 13. And the generative point is the fifth. So within the octave, it's the fifth, which is the generative note, which allows the octave to come into being. Whereas in the chromatic scale, it's the 8th note that allows this generative possibility to come forth. So we have 5 of 8, 8 of 13, Fibonacci numbers again. So that's what I was describing, how once you have the Fibonacci numbers, which express or which approximate the golden ratio, you have the possibility of turning the musical ratios into the octave, generating the musical scale. Whereas the raw materials from it, the actual musical ratios, come from the intelligence of Mercury, of the nous. Now, I've dampened down all these other numbers now, so they don't dazzle you too much. So Venus's orbit to Earth's orbit is approximated as 8 to 13. And then if we put in the synodic cycle of Earth and Venus, then we have a relationship of 5 to 8. Now, there's not many more to go now, but this one, 243 days, this is the sidereal day of Venus. So this is Venus's move in relation to itself rather than in relation to the sun. Now, rather amazingly, bearing in mind that this is the generative number that brings about the 3:2 musical ratio, and it comes from Mercury contemplating its own thoughts rather than looking towards the sun. Or similarly, this number, the sidereal day of Venus, has a 3:2 relationship with Earth's annual cycle. So the same ratio comes down from the soul down to the earthly. So Earth's cycle divided by 243 gives 1.5, which is, again, 3:2. So if we had a musical string like so, and we said that this is 365.25, 243 is at that 3:2 point. So again, that generative musical ratio is the 3:2. And of course, when we're looking at Fibonacci numbers, as we were just then in relation to the scale, that means that the musical fifth in some way resembles the golden section. It's not exact, you can't sort of actually define it in terms of measurement as the golden section, but the fact that it's off center within the scale and it relates to 13 to 8, 8 to 5, it naturally resembles, numerically resembles the golden ratio. And so again, it's the golden ratio is that generative principle by which things come forth. And goodness knows, we're surrounded by it in this world in terms of everything that grows. So there's so much golden ratio everywhere. Now, the last ones to fill in are these two. So Earth's solar day and its sidereal day, they're very, very close. It's almost unison in musical terms, almost one-to-one. It's not possible for it to be one-to-one, because that would mean that Earth wasn't spinning around the sun, or Earth wasn't going around the sun, which obviously can't happen. So just to sum up, because there's loads of information, these are what give the musical ratios, the 2, 1, 3, 2, and then inevitably the 4, 3. This is the one that's between pi and 3, with its looking upwards from the soul up to the 1, up towards the intelligence, which is contemplating the sun. This is that pi relationship that Earth has with Mercury. This is that 2 to 1 or that 3 to 2 musical ratio, the generative one that comes down to Earth with its relationship with planet Earth. These two have the Fibonacci relationship of 8 to 13, and this one is 5 to 8. And this is that synodic cycle where they don't quite meet, but they get 144 to 143. That's the actual conjunction cycle, just over 144. And then you have nearly unison with the 2 days of Earth. But is there something that we're missing out here? Is there something that I haven't mentioned? I mentioned the moon very briefly in relation to Earth with that pyramid triangle. But if we look back at this, back at Mercury's knowledge of the musical ratios, if we can go back to the smallest unit that we have, which I suppose you could say is the distance between here and here, if the whole line is divided into 3, that's 2/3, and this is 1/3. So what's the difference between 88 and 58.666? And that is a very good approximation of the lunar cycle. And so the moon is there as a way of contemplating the one itself. And of course, the moon reflects the light of the one down to us here on Earth. Now, to finish off, just a small epilogue. You know I like talking about Wales Cathedral. I spent quite a while doing it 2 weeks ago. Now, you remember, I used the tetractys, the Pythagorean tetractys, just as a way of engaging with the idea of Plotinus's hypostases and matter. Up in the Lady Chapel of the cathedral, which you may remember if you saw my talk a couple of weeks ago, that is a place that seems to symbolize the resurrected Christ. So it's the soul having returned to its true state. It is Venus or Aphrodite Urania, the heavenly part of the soul. Now, within the chapel, if you look up there, you can see these tetractys-shaped windows. Well, there's 5 of them. And of course, bearing in mind that the tetractys is 10, 5 times 10 is 50, and so it reflects the 5 decades of the rosary beads. And there's all sorts of rosary numerics in here, because this was built at the same sort of time that the rosary beads were developing. In fact, the earliest depiction of the 5-fold rosary is about 2 decades before the chapel was built. But the other thing about what's actually in the main window, the one at the eastern wall, so you could say this is the highest window in the whole cathedral, symbolically speaking, because it's on the east wall and it's at the top of the 5 lights. So it's this one here. Now, it has lots of angels on these levels, all looking upwards towards the one. Now, having said that, there is this one angel here who appears to have the face perhaps angled downwards or angled away. But even this one, when you see the eyes are still looking up to the one. Now, there is no part of the soul in the 3rd level that's looking down, because this is the east end of the cathedral. It's the highest window, so everything has returned back looking up to the one, whereas the one itself is looking at us in the eternity of the present moment. And that's it. Can anyone recount all those numbers to me by sort of by memory?
From last week or from your So the mind is in chaos once again. We need another lockdown just to take it all in. Tom, thank you. What a masterful synthesis of the quadrivial arts. Number, music, geometry, the study of the heavens, those essential studies that Socrates tells us, we engage with them, we work with them, we synthesize them, and the inner eye, the eye of the heart, can be rekindled, purified. The inner eye is worth 10,000 fleshly eyes. So Tom.
10 to the power of 4, 10,000.
Okay.
4 levels
Crumbs.
of the tenfold tetractys.
I came across a Plotinus quote just the other day. Just going to share it with you. It seems very appropriate. We have a wise man in our midst. All teems with symbol. The wise man is the man who in any one thing can read another. And Tom, you've got the knack. It's a great skill. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm sure there'll be many questions. I have been asked just to remind you, if you do have a question, please hold it until you have a microphone brought to you, because it was a little hard last time for the people who are joining us via the webcam to hear. And also one other thing I've been asked to say just at the end of the talk, if you could, what with these enhanced regulations that the City of London is currently in, just be a little bit respectful. We don't all jump on Tom at the end. Keep a safe distance. And have we any questions? The lady here.
Yes, Tom, is that working? Is this section in your forthcoming book, please?
No, it won't be. It'll have to be in something else, because I only just found it really recently, and it would be, the book's already really long already. But yeah, so it'll be in another publication of some sort. It might have to be the third one, so I've got a second book lined up already.
I hate to ask this, but somebody's got to. Not quite. Does that drive you insane? That you know that it's just a teeny bit out, some of those?
I suppose it's something we have to try and live with, isn't it? Because isn't that just like life? I mean, that in a sense is what I was saying at the beginning, because I think the reason why modern science only recognizes the spin orbit resonance of Mercury is because it's so precise that it leads them to feel that, you know, there's enough circumstantial evidence. But I would go much further with that, because obviously I'm a Platonist, and so I would say that you're never going to get perfect resemblances ever, but you're going to get things that do remind you of them, because of course a Platonist begins from the forms in a certain sense and then works their way up to them through the manifestation. So it's a different mentality, but yeah, I suppose we have to live with those imperfections of this world. I mean, like I said about unison, you know, with the 2 days of Earth, the sidereal day and the solar day, they can't be at unison. It wouldn't be possible, because that would mean that Earth wasn't spinning.
They're not quite allows life to happen, doesn't it? We have a German astronomer friend, Hartmut Warm, who gives the example of the human heart, and the only time that it beats pretty much in a perfect rhythm is just before we die. Other than that, there's always these fluctuations. And
amazing. Okay.
It's like the tuning, you know, the musical tuning, because the well-tempered clavier is not
Right, yeah, really
all of that.
good points, yes.
And then there's the sacred tuning forks. You know those, don't you?
No, I'm not sure of that.
Okay, I'll tell you about them another time. But they're exact. But we don't use them to play.
Right, I mean, I suppose, yeah, if it's well, just intonation, which does feel like the musical ratio is coming to a full fruition of some sort, as you say, it won't work if you tune, or at least you can't transpose from one key to another. And we have to, I suppose, knock all of these notes into this uniform shape, rather like stacking boxes in a factory, to actually make the musical scale work in that way. But it does mean that it's very practical and very usable, and certain types of music become possible as a result of it. But then it is suggested that, as you say, these other tunings, such as just intonation, have, or they're closer to purity I mean, Pythagorean tuning, which is 3 limits, that's even before the just intonation. That is very clunky and not very practical, but it's sort of very ideal in its formulation. So with the descent from the 1, there's a gradual losing of the purity, but there is a building up of the practicality and the usefulness. And that in itself, I suppose, is another expression of what's been talked about.
But it's also like us, you know, no one has got 2, you know, there's always a bit that's 1 foot's a bit bigger than all of that kind of stuff. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hang on, Emma.
Plotinus. How much does Plotinus actually talk about what you talk about? I mean, he just says, you know, from the 1 to the many, and then you've elaborated on that. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm looking at things from a heliocentric view, which isn't something, I mean, it's considered that it probably was known, like Philolaus, the Pythagorean, talked about the fire at the center. But it's, I suppose, the geocentric view was more what was around then. I'm just using, I suppose, a current knowledge that we can have to show that, or to suggest that Plotinus is somehow intuitively recognizing the natural way of things and how they emanate forth. Because obviously these planets don't literally come from the sun, but the way in which they relate to one another does reflect those relationships. But yeah, he doesn't talk about things in the way that I have.
Refers to.
Oh, well, he does talk about, well, he uses the sun as a symbol of the one, and also soul as Aphrodite. So he talks about those 2 halves of Aphrodite. But I suppose Mercury, or at least in the form of Hermes Trismegistus, then that naturally relates to planet Mercury and the 4-fold materiality. I mean, the thing perhaps I didn't emphasize enough is that it's through coming down to Earth that all of these things that are descending take on their form. Earth is like the stopping point, but it's where all of these things become fully apparent. And so when you use the Earth day and the Earth year, even though you can see them gradually as there's a descent from the 1 in terms of what's going on with the planets, but it's once they reach Earth that all of that which has come down really shows itself in this very ideal form numerically, once you have the Earth year and the Earth day.
Tom, you reminded me of in your those amazing ratios of Mercury, of Hermes, a 3-fold, this thrice great Hermes. We all look up to Hermes Trismegistus, and in each of our coming to Earth, in our arrival, isn't it remarkable that we are blessed while we're in our mother's wombs by thrice great Mercury? Pretty much exactly 3 Mercury turnings around the sun, 3 trimesters. So 9 moons equals 3 Mercury years. Wow. Isn't that beautiful? And you threw the moon in just at the end.
Oh, the 29.33, of course. So, yeah, absolutely.
But the moon and Mercury, they have a lot in common, don't they?
And I suppose in that sense, Earth's relationship with the moon is a bit like the sun's relationship with Mercury, or at least that first orbital form, because as you say, they are quite similar in terms of, I suppose, size and the piness that they express. Yes?
So, this is the work of Plotinus. You're discussing Plotinus.
No, I'm showing cosmological relationships that, in a certain sense, appear to reflect the way that Plotinus talked about his philosophy. So it's just, I suppose I'm suggesting that Plotinus intuitively recognized the way of things, and you see that same way of things in the unfolding of planets from the sun, symbolically speaking.
So people before Plotinus, they wouldn't necessarily... so Pythagoras was working on something else to get his musical scales.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's just the basis of how a stretched string works, or if you blow through a pipe. If you divide the string into 2, you'll get a particular note.
But it's not based on the sun and Venus and Mercury.
No, absolutely not. I mean, but Mercury reflects the same mathematics as Pythagoras was looking into with the material form of the musical string.
So he would have known the Mercury mathematics sum of it.
Who knows? Who knows? He wouldn't need to, but he might do. I mean, I don't know how much of Mercury, of the movements of Mercury was known. I'm sure the 22 to 7 would have been known, or the
Because
the
Hermes
approximation
is
of it.
very old, isn't it? Hermes Trismegistus is very old. I mean, the Egyptians.
He's associated with the ancient Egyptians, absolutely. I mean, there are some who contest that and say he's a more recent figure. He's the third of 3 Hermeses. You first have the god Hermes, then you have, in the Arabic tradition, you have a second Hermes who's in Babylon, who teaches Pythagoras, and then the third Hermes is thrice great Hermes. And he's a mix of Hermes and Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom.
Thank you. That's lovely. Thank you.
Is there a question at the back? This gentleman at the back.
In numerology, the number 22 is said to be a master number. I just wondered if you knew of any Eastern Indian, for example, sources that correlated the reason for that being a master number with what you've said.
I think there's 22 in the musical scale in the Indian. That's one instance of 22 I can think of. But are you talking more about something like Kabbalistic numerology? Because that has the 22 letters in
possibly. I remember going to a talk where someone looked at people's birthdays and how that came down to a single number going up to 22, and 22 was said to be the master number. I wondered if there was a correlation.
I'm sure that all these things relate in some way. I mean, one thing about 11 and its multiples is that you see it a huge amount within all these cosmological measurements. Say, for instance, in John Michell's diagram, which is really a rediscovery on his part of something from the ancient world. That's all based around these multiples of 11. So I can't really say much more than that, I'm afraid. But yes, there are 22, I think it's 22 Shrutis in the Indian scale. I'm pretty sure that's 122 I can think of from India. But I think of 22 in numerology as being more from the Kabbalistic tradition because of the 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet.
I know that through various centuries ago, there was talk also of the heavenly spheres. Each planet had its own melody, and then all the planets together then formed some sort of musical harmony. Do you know any more about that? I'm not an expert, but I know I'm a musician, and I have heard of that before.
I think the music of the spheres can't be heard as such, but they are perhaps in some way reflecting a numerical harmony that you would find within music. I mean, if you want solid down-to-earth examples, or perhaps up to Mercury examples, then there is that example of and the Mercury numbers are very precise, like particularly the spin orbit resonance, which is one of these things that's recognized. But the 176 days, which has the 2-to-1 relationship with the 88 days of the orbit, that probably is where you find them in a really pronounced way. But yeah, I think the music of the spheres is more to do with the overarching harmony that arises out of the application of number to the raw material, rather than being, I mean, there might be other people who have other things to say about that, but that's what I think of saying to the question.
Perhaps time for one further question, or maybe that's enough.
Or perhaps silence, which is the best music of all.
But before silence, let me shamelessly plug a couple of very important things. One, of course, is Tom's forthcoming book, Kosmos in Stone. And I think most of you have already signed up for your